One of the things we were talking about yesterday, I want to bring up something we were talking about. And you mentioned your father in Tennessee
Uh-huh.
after the King assassination, or after one of the Kennedy assassinations.
After one of the Kennedys, yeah.
Tell that story.
Okay, and so I think the context of that story during this conversation was we were talking about just the national conversation and reckoning of race and racism that's happening in America right now, where it feels like a lot of white people discovered that racism exists like yesterday, and that is bad, and so now we're talking about it, and some gestures are being made as a result of that. And part of this, I guess, education came Juneteenth, which it was surreal how quickly the change from, okay, Juneteenth is a day that some Black people celebrate, some of us don't, and some of us maybe weren't even aware that it exists, to now it's like white people having Juneteenth cookouts. And it's like, okay, that's a little odd, but all right, whatever. And so we were I was talking about just, how we learn things, how we know things that we don't necessarily learn in school. And one of those instances was my dad telling me about, he was in Knoxville College, Tennessee, and I forget which Kennedy was assassinated. This was in the 60s. And him being in Knoxville, Tennessee, and people celebrating in the streets because of that. This national tragedy, and there's a celebration happening. And so my dad is 73 years old. He's not 90, he's not 100. What he's talking about did not happen 100 years ago. It happened less than 50 years ago.
I was so struck when you told me those two things just when we were rapping.
60. I got my math wrong, but it didn't happen that long.
Within living memory. Within living memory.
Within living memory, yeah.
And by people who are still with us. And there are two, in writing this book, I wanted to write a book about integration as opposed to race, out of the sense that the rhetoric of race reached a limit as far as I was concerned, whereby you couldn't get into the interior of the person. And so we learn these languages of race, and going back and looking, I found that this theater of racial awakening has been performed, right, which is what the Juneteenth celebrations are. And I call it a theater, but it is, Americans have been becoming aware of race, the problems of race, for 400 years, going back to the Revolution. And the moment that we're in now is of a piece with the revolutionary moment, with the Civil War moment, with the Civil Rights moment, and that resistance that you spoke of hit me so powerfully, because the Civil Rights movement was largely a success, but we forget how many people were dead set against it.
Yeah, and I feel like a less charitable but more honest way of encapsulating that is that it never ended. And we speak of the civil rights era in a past tense. And certainly there have been measures, there have been laws, it's different now. I'm not going to deny that it's different today than it was in 1968. But, I think for so often that we look at history as these separate like vacuums of activity, instead of just a continual arc that has dips and valleys and plateaus sometimes, and then dips and then rises some more. And I feel like what we're in right now, it's depending on your perspective, it's either another dip or it's another escalation. Again, depending on what perspective you're coming from. But I it doesn't, this is still continuing. This conversation, that the conversation didn't stop when the Civil Rights Act was passed. It just continued, or it was tabled, but it didn't just stop.
I think that, I mean, I would push that further and say it is the phenomenon that undergirds American politics. And one of the things I was trying to do here was look beyond, right, like to connect the political language, the cultural language, to the sociology, like the language of sociology of healthcare and phenomena, right? This push-pull of civil rights is, I would argue, the fundamental phenomena of America. And I'm like, I take the long view on this when I say, oh, we make this compromise at like during the Continental Congress, and whereby we will allow slavery, but we think it's on its way out. We're gonna set we'll put provisions in the Constitution that abolish the transatlantic trade. We won't use the word slavery, and you're already on the line for the Civil War. After the Civil War, right, emancipation is only the beginning, because it does in fact lead to full freedom, like after the end of Reconstruction, and then civil rights. And so I'm putting this all in a larger context, like as you say, like the historical context. The push-pull and that conversation has never stopped, because it is in fact the exception we've made to American democracy that has to be completed.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, and I think our conception of this is it's self-centered. Like when we think of things having an arc and a narrative, we tend to think of these things happening within our lifetimes. And so, you know, King's phrase, you know, the arc of the universe bends towards justice. I think that for some of us, and particularly for white people too, white Americans, there's a belief that this arc, that bend is going to happen in their lifetimes. And I mean, we're talking about a 400-year-old problem. And I mean, it maybe it feels defeatist to say that actually, yeah, we're not going to see any real substantive change until 2000, till the 2400th century. But that's a possibility. It's a possibility that we are hundreds of years off from where we actually think that we could be. Not months, not years, not decades, but centuries. And that's, again, that's a thing that it's almost impossible to fathom, just how long things take sometimes, and just the reality that we may not be alive to see it.
And this is, I think there's space, like, I'm actually an optimist. I would frame and say, you know, this thing, and the King quote has its roots in Immanuel Kant's observation about democracy, in which he says, this is an idea that is so powerful, it is destined to encompass the entire world. And so, and that's where the long arc of justice comes. And so you'd say, well, we've been in it long enough. It's 400 years, and it is our duty, our job to complete it now, or to move it forward, because I think those of us here who have been produced by a culture after the Civil Rights Movement, you know, the gains that were won that we've benefited from. However, right, and we're the first generations in this country who were not wholly produced by segregation. We're supposed to move that forward, right? If you believe, as I do, that the racial exception to democracy is the fundamental problem in this country, it's the problem in which all of our tyranny is based, and the tyranny of people we see on the right at the moment, those racial instincts and visions are all based on the Black exception, the Native American exception to the experiment in democracy. And so, yes, it's conceivable it'll take longer. I think it'd be done in a couple of generations. Do you think that's too soon?
I mean, a couple generations, that's still, what, 100 years? 120. I mean, we're not going to be here to see that.
But we have to move it forward.
Yeah, we have to move it forward, but I think that it's human. I think that it's not just American nature, but almost human nature to want to move towards, or want to build towards something that you'll actually see, that you'll actually be around. Now, obviously we are cognizant of legacy and recognize that we're not going to live forever. But I do wonder if more people were aware or realized or just thought that, this, what we're working on now, we're not going to have like a finished product for about another 300 years. Like, what does that do? What does that do to someone's psyche? What does that do to someone's just the sort of emotional and spiritual bandwidth that you require to do this sort of reckoning, this sort of deconstruction, this sort of questioning?
And so societies, right, cultures are ever changing, societies move forward, but we have a distinct opportunity. When we look at the protests going on all around this country right now, that is, and we can argue about how sincere some of it is, how focused some of it is. That's the spirit of democracy at work. Mm-hmm. And so when I look at that, I see thousands and thousands and thousands of people saying we want a more complete American democracy that we can in fact change, because you told us democracy was free. And this is one of the differences between, I think, growing up Black in America and growing up white, is as a white person, you're like, right, you're given a certain myth of the country, and this racial awareness happens. You're like, oh wait, everyone doesn't get that, and you're like, and you can believe that myth because you grow up in segregated space. You grow up in a neighborhood that's for all intents and purposes segregated, a suburban neighborhood, an exurban neighborhood, a gentrified neighborhood, and then there's this consciousness raising. Oh my God, the world isn't as Black people always know that. And so you can never escape it. And now we're in this moment of people saying like, oh, I'm learning something I didn't know. People come to knowledge when they will. And one of the things I would say is that we're too narrowly focused on violence in law enforcement, because violence in law enforcement is connected to economic violence. It is connected to cultural violence. It is connected to the interpersonal violence that we sometimes call microaggression, sometimes more overt than that. And we need to talk about all of these sites of harm.
Well, that you said a lot just now. And that last point about the hyper focus on police violence, I do, and I'm not an abolitionist scholar, but from what I know of that work, the conversation about abolition, the conversation about defunding the police isn't just centered on the police. It's centered on just a holistic community approach of reducing harm and reducing violence and creating different modes of accountability everywhere. So from what I understand, it's not just about the police violence, and although that is the most immediate, the most urgent part of it, it's more of we need to imagine different modes of existing. And so we talked about this on the phone yesterday. We talked for about an hour, just about this conversation about your book. And a point that I brought up thinking about just the construction of America, and particularly democracy, and how so much of our conversation about democracy is that it's this perfect, close to perfect thing, but the execution and application has been flawed through these last hundreds of years. And I'm starting to think that perhaps the construction of it was flawed too. And as I said in a conversation that we had earlier, I think about standardized tests and how we have a general consensus now that standardized tests are biased, and they're biased in favor of the people that created them. All they do is prove that you're able to really do well in these tests. If you do well on your SAT, it proves that you are able to do well on your SAT. And so I wonder if, think about the founding fathers and, the number of white men in that room with somewhat similar backgrounds. How different would our Constitution look, would our Bill of Rights, would all that shit look if it was more of if there were 4 white men, 3 white women, 3 black men, 5 black women in that room? Like, would it, and also maybe 6 indigenous people in that room? Would everyone on the same page in terms of wanting a democracy, would the construction of it be different than what we have today?
Well, it's an interesting thought experiment, and I would say this, that, and you can't relitigate the past, and today you can have that. Today, you do have the possibility, right? And that's the conversation that needs to be had. What happens if you take this flawed thing that we were given that was, I think, rapturous almost in its conception and the spirit in America at the time of founding? You make these exclusions, but you see it has opened little by little, but too little over too long a time. But now you have a chance, right? So that's what we're doing here. We are sitting at the table and we're saying, we're going to change this. We're going to abolish the flaws, or better the flaws in this design. That's in fact what the Civil War was about, right? And so the Constitution, that's where the amendments passed after the Second Constitution, that's called that's the Second American Republic. And I think we have the possibility now to create a third iteration of this country, because it looks different, and you do have people coming from different places, but everyone believed in that idealistic notion called democracy. Right? So the past is the past, but it gives us a foundation, it gives us some flaws. And I think our job, generation over generation, as it's always been, right? Like, that's what leads to civil war, that's what leads to the civil rights movement. And it's to get past those problems, those antique problems, and on to better ones.
Okay. So we'll get back to that. And since, let's leave the past in the past and talk a little bit more about the present. Particularly, there's a chapter in your book. And I'm just going to show everyone because it's not on screen, More Perfect Reunion. Please cop this if you can. The link is somewhere in the chat somewhere. So please, everyone, buy it. When this is done, or buy it now. Just X out this conversation, is buy the book right now. So you have a chapter where you talk about Randall and This Is Us, and I guess the idea of performance and the idea of race, and how he's this perfect character. Basically, he is. I didn't really recognize how Poitier-esque he was until you make that point where he is like I would marry him. Like right now, I would divorce my wife and go marry Randall. He's that perfect. And so and you follow that with a conversation about The Sopranos, and particularly how The Sopranos were so on point with so much else, with the intricacies of family, of Italian, of old school Italian American culture in the 21st century, and the clash between mafia family and this nuclear family. But you mentioned that David Chase had a blind spot when it came to race, particularly Blackness. And there's a Black character who ends up dating Meadow. And I remember him, Noah. He was kind of a dick, but I remember him. And you had a frustration with how David Chase wrote that story and also created that character. And I wonder, though, if the minimization of him and the way they were just really dismissive is actually, I would have been inauthentic for David Chase to have a deeper conversation and a more nuanced relationship with that character. Because I feel like he exemplified how we're often considered in predominantly white neighborhoods and predominantly white, communities.
And so there are two things at play, right? And this is like what's going on in that chapter as a whole. It's to show the ways that race isn't something that just was created in the past, to show the ways that we're constantly recreating it and the ways that our culture is constantly reinforcing it. Right? The Randall character is, right, through this performance of exceptionalism, he's thereby acceptable, right? And so if you work until your eyes bleed and you're polite and you say the right things and wear the right things and go to the right schools, then you too can be a part of America. Never mind the 30 million Black people still in poverty. So, right, that's the performance that's going on there. It's this post-racial exceptionalism. In the case of Chase, it is, and I'm sure a bunch of people in the chat have seen The Sopranos. I want to show how you can be exquisitely sophisticated about, right, exquisitely well-educated, and The Sopranos is a very sophisticated piece of postmodernism in many ways, and right, postmodernity by which we began to be aware of the ways the author is constructing stories, the ways the story is being made. And so the story is constantly in conversation with film history. It's constantly saying, like, I'm like, right, this is the story, but this is what's going on in making the story, and so on and so forth. And right, it becomes turtles a certain way down until you hit race. And would it have been inauthentic to Chase's experience? What I'm arguing is it's a character who, by the laws of the form he's following, and he's following masterfully, he misses an opportunity. He fails. He doesn't understand his own characters and the ways in which, when we look at Blackness, when most people look at a Black person, it all collapses. And so, all of these things going on. You be Damon Young, writer, journalist, entrepreneur, and to someone passing in the street, you're like, yeah, this guy with dreadlocks. And it all collapses. And whatever attaches to their notion of that then becomes who you are. And that's what happens in that text. And it was incredible. And so it makes the show racist. It also, is one of the popular shows on air. America embraced at the turn of the century, these racist stereotypes. No one questioned it until much later. And it becomes a part of the culture. And so the point is that we're still telling racial stories, racialized narratives, harmful narratives to this day.
Yeah, I struggle with that. I struggle with that just because okay, and I'll shift a little bit to, did you watch Girls? Elena Dunham's show. Okay, so I watched a few seasons of that, but I was more into just the zeitgeist scene of that show and the cultural conversation around her, around that show, around representation, around all of that. And the first season, she was roundly criticized for creating this homogenous world in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, it was criticized for being inauthentic. It's like, how can you have these millennials living in, I forgot if they were in Brooklyn, but let's just say they were in Brooklyn, and have this stark white world. And I always felt weird about that criticism, because I think that is extremely possible to do that. It is extremely possible to curate whiteness or blackness if you want to. I mean, yeah, you might have a black barista or a black coworker, but you can curate that experience. And so, and so thinking about her and thinking about David Chase, I don't know. I don't know if I would expect, or if I would want, or if even they're required to have that same sort of nuance that they have with everything else with race. If again, these shows that are created are these labors of love,
So,
and they're also based off.
I'm gonna jump in, because the question, right? You're asking a narrative question, and certainly most white Americans live in worlds that are, they're all white. We live in segregated worlds, right? We tell segregated stories. That is part of the problem, right? And so whether or not, without having seen the show, whether or not it's authentic to her experience and who she is one question. What it does when you put it in the culture is another. And the point I was making with Chase, who tells all these points, right? He talks about, and he gives an interview, and it's beautiful to me, because he says, you see, I grew up in a family, when he's talking about the accusations of racism, I grew up in a family in which we weren't hardcore racists. We weren't what you call the white sheep racists, but people would say, oh, they're trying to take this from you. They're like this, they're like that. And then he takes and depicts that, right? And I think subconsciously, not knowingly, and then you put that story into the zeitgeist, and people applaud it, and uncritically. And so you see that unknowing bit of racial, right? That unknowing racism gets recreated first of all, inside of his psyche and consciousness, then on the screen, and again in the psyches and consciousness of those watching. This is all happening subconsciously. And one of the things that I speak to in the book is how subconscious recreation and the transmission of race is. And some of it happens private, some of it happens in public, right? And there are things that we talk about, right? There are theaters and there are performances of race, of racial awakening, of a grievance that happen in public. And there are other conversations that take place in private. And that was, right, Chase was a window for me onto the things that we say in public, right? As art is, right? That's one of the spaces where you get this peek into the deep interior and the interior as it meets the broader culture. One of the studies I show, and one of the things I speak to, is the condition, right? All these things go to racial conditioning. I talk about the rat study, in which you raise white rats in a cage and black rats in a cage and spotted rats in a cage, and they exhibit empathy toward rats who share their phenotype. If you raise them in the same cage, then they only see ratness, and their empathy becomes universal toward rats. And the argument here is, in a segregated society, you are constantly reproducing violent or bias, and in many cases violence, and the ways that the structures that we don't see, that we don't interrogate, are doing this for us. And we're so trapped within these structures. You're like, oh, my television is doing it, my newspaper is doing it, the company I work for is doing it, the schools I go to are doing it, my neighborhood is doing it. How do I get out of that? How do I get out of that? And the way, if like, if in fact one wants to get out and believes it's possible to get out, which I do, right, sounds like we might not agree fully on that, the way to dismantle these structures is to change, right, it's to make this a less segregated state. I use the term integration, which goes back to, right, it begins in where it's popularized by Kennedy, and right, and it's a redress to discrimination against African Americans in the labor force. We begin, right, like under the Civil Rights Act, we begin to understand in very holistic ways, right, the original Civil Rights Movement, and like, and it feeds the Civil Rights Act. And you have to talk about housing, you have to talk about education, you have to talk about employment, you have to talk about voting, you have to talk about all of these sites of harm. And in the time since, we've become accustomed to talking about one piece of it or another. We can talk about the culture, we can talk about, right, the economic forces, the law enforcement, but we talk about them piecemeal. And you see the beauty of that original movement, the beauty of thinkers like Frederick Douglass, is they understood how total this was, and that you have to talk about it all. Integration allows you to do that. And integration is where, and this goes back to founding, when people say we've got to abolish slavery, and the next question, even among abolitionists, is, well, how do you integrate all of these people who everyone hates now? And that becomes the question for Lincoln after the Civil War, right? And then you get a compromise, and Hayes says, give me your electoral votes, I'll like pull the federal troops out, we won't enforce Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Act, right, the civil rights gains are immediately rolled back at the turn of the century. And so you're fighting for the same thing again in the middle of the 20th century. And now we're fighting for those same things, and we can say that we have a new language of it, but we need a real vision that moves things forward, right?
Yeah, and what you articulated is just a lack of imagining, and I think that we are. I don't want to say that we're cursed with that, but I think that it definitely is a hurdle of being able to envision these worlds that these worlds that they almost exist in a wormhole on like behind a planet, and we could get there, but we just can't envision exactly how that's going to look.
Dude, your life is a product of integration. My life is a product of integration. So we know what that looks like. Right?
But I'm talking in terms of not just integration, and I'm not talking in terms not just us, but a better example could be the coming back to the police abolition movement that is happening across the country right now. This seems unfathomable to me. I cannot imagine a world, a country without that. Without law enforcement. Without that. And again, but the thing is, my lack of imagining doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means that I haven't imagined. I just haven't imagined it yet. And I even think the same way, when it with the conversation about reparations, where the actual application of it, how would you even begin to do that? But again, that's not. I don't feel like that's my question to answer.
So all these things are subsets of what I call integration. All these things that you point to are sites of racial harm. And I bring it back to integration at, right, it's resistance, reinforcement of the race line in all of these spaces, right? And you're like, what I hear you saying is, I can't imagine a world that treats Black people fairly. And I'm saying, I can. I'm saying there's a vision for that, have a vision for that. We see enough exceptions of it. We perform a Potemkin village of it through, right, what we call diversity, through Black exceptionalism. And what integration means is extending that to everyone. right? Certainly the 30 million Black people who live in poverty to this day, everyone. When I talk about, or when someone talks about gender rights, when they're talking about civil rights. When you talk about rights, you're talking about civil rights. Everyone deserves the same rights. I think we can imagine that.
Oh yeah, definitely. I guess with my, I just want to clarify when I talk about a lack of imagining, not necessarily an existence where we all have equal rights, but there's certain mechanisms of society that exist right now, and I'm just trying to imagine a society without them.
Anything made can be unmade. That's Frederick Douglass, and I love that quote. And so all of these are constructions. They're simple constructions, and what does it mean? Like, what does it look like when you unmake them? Again, we can unmake them, and we will find out. So, when you're talking about sites of real harm, when you're talking about the race line, that's an easy thing to unmake in a country that has made a New Deal, that's made it's enforced a Marshall Plan. And I'm talking simply about nation building at home. And this is where it gets tricky. When everyone has the same rights, we're all free and equal and have equal self-determination, people decide that they really want to live in a police state, well, it's the will of the people and you have to live with that. What I'm talking about are the things that, it's the state before that. How do you unmake the race line? You integrate society.
So how does that look for you? Like,
again, we know how it looks. Dane, we know how this looks. When people look at Obama and Michelle, they say they're wonderful. You look at Oprah, you look at all these amazing Black people who we rightfully celebrate. Those are people who have had access to full opportunities of this nation. Now, in many cases, in all cases, they've had to overcome special hurdles to achieve the things that they have. What I'm saying is there are lots of Baracks, there are lots of Michelles, there are lots of Oprahs. They should have the same opportunities. That's what that looks like. So this theater of diversity, this theater of tokenism, of exceptionalism, of post-racialism, of colorblindness, of all the lies, all the narratives that we give ourselves, all the increasingly Baroque things are no longer so. Everyone has equal opportunity. That's pretty easy for me to imagine.
Oh, I feel like that there is a, I feel like we're getting lost in translation here because I think that we are arguing the same thing. And perhaps I'm not articulating the point that I was trying to make, but that's all right.
You're saying, I think you're asking the question, do we have the will to do that?
Well, and my question isn't about us and isn't about our capacity to be exceptional or just exist. As you were, in that chapter where you were talking about Sopranos and This Is Us, you also talked about Atlanta. And these characters, Earn and what's his name? What's the
Paperboy?
Not Paperboy, but
Lakeith Stanfield character.
Yeah, Lakeith Stanfield's character. I'm blanking on his name. But how they just exist. They are like Earn went to Ivy League school, but he just exists. And so the world, the imagining is a place where you don't have to be the Obamas. You don't have to be LeBron James. You could just exist and just be as free as Barack Obama is. But I guess my question, though, to that, freer. My question to that, though, is what would be the incentive, not for us, but for America, for white people? What's the incentive and what's the incentive?
So here's the incentive. De Tocqueville notes in the 19th century, if this country fails, it will be because of its racial tyranny. Full stop. And we see now that those who are tyrants of democracy always need an other. Right, so I'm doing this to protect you from the other. I'm creating a police state to keep the Black people away from you. I'm going to suspend civil liberties to protect you from people of Middle Eastern descent. It's always this otherization. And once you allow that, once you subscribe to that, then you're no longer subscribing to democracy. And so what is in it for people who may or may not share our concerns? It's very simple. It's the thing is going to fall apart if you continue in this path, right? Like they are the people who we talk about when we say they, and this is the hard right, the Trumpists, as opposed to the center who have their own right problems of accommodation. They democracy fundamentally. And again, this goes back to Douglas. You see, there's nothing new that we can say about race, which is why we need to move on from race and start talking about these solutions in a more meaningful way. Douglas says, and this is when he's arguing for Black suffrage, after this war, those who are fighting you today will hate the government. They will teach their children to hate the government, right? And their grandchildren and so on. It's the same thing. All this is constructed on race. And if you look at the rhetoric on the right, what happens after Johnson passes the Civil Rights Act in 1964, Nixon immediately starts crafting a new political language very successfully. And Nixon is running first against George Wallace in the South, and Wallace is out saying N-word, N-word, N-word. And people in the North found that distasteful. Nixon uses more polite language of race. He starts talking about law and order. He starts talking about taxes, right? He starts talking, all of these things are codes and they become more and more opaque, but they're codes and everyone knows what you're talking about, and that's acceptable. If you don't say the N-word, but you enforce these policies that kept Black people in their places, I can accept that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hey, so we're gonna answer some questions. Some questions for Calvin. First question. Okay. This is from Sandra Miller. How do you see the realities that we tend to define the various false construct of races as monolithic? I am old enough to have been in this discussion for many decades. I'm taking for white because of my skin color, but I am a Semite. There is much to be learned from delving deeper into some other vision of the human race and honors our similarities and our differences. How is where we are now, with Blacks in the position of being heard in a way they have not been before, lead us to reunion?
Okay, so race is a myth. And we all know this. We know this in many facets of our lives. Like, oh, I believe in the human race. We know, we study biology. We know that the differences between a person who presents with one phenotype and another is scant. But we build everything on these myths, on these lies. And you're right, I talk about this in the book. At best, it is a primitive way of saying, well, gee, why do some people have dark skin? Some people have light skins. Maybe they live near the equator. Like, I don't know. And so it's a bumbling way to explain phenotypical differences. It becomes very quickly a technology of oppression. I am better than them, they're like this, and all these things, and they play out through history, and they play out, right? Black people in America have always just been at the bottom of that totem pole. And what does it mean for Black people to finally be heard in a unique way? And I don't know that we're being fully heard yet. I think that the conversation still has a way to go. People say, oh, they've been protesting, they've been talking. Like, this is going on for a month, 2 months. This needs to go on for years. Mm-hmm. But Black people bear the burden of explaining democracy and fighting for democracy for everyone. That has been our unfair burden in this nation. So race in and of itself means nothing to me. However, the effects of race are real, and they're all consuming in society. And you can't like wave a magical wand and say race doesn't exist, I'm post-racial, until you've attended to everything that's been built on top of those lies.
Next is from Carrie O'Brien. Why did you decide to write this book?
Frustrated with the language of race. As someone who grew up, I mean, my first education grew up on people like Baldwin, grew up on people like Morrison, was trained in people like Said and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. The public conversation about race had begun to seem repetitive, and it also seemed increasingly siloed. And in teaching, I had all these amazing students who would talk about their grievances, the ways that their rights and liberties were being curtailed, the ways that their personhood was being abbreviated. But they were talking about in all these antique ways that don't move anything forward. And so I started to really listen to this and say, what's missing? We're not looking past it. And how do you get past this? You have to see beyond it. You have to have a vision of what happens after race, because you can get caught up in all of those like nooks and crannies and the spiraling psychological factors forever, which in fact we have. And so I wanted to offer a way to move through this for the solution.
Okay. This is from an anonymous attendee. What do you think are some of the more immediate, concrete actions needed to move us closer to an anti-racist, more equitable society? Do you think that greater economic equality for everyone, particularly Black Americans, is a major part of this?
I think so. I talk about this in the book. Race happens at three fundamental sites, and you have to talk about all the sites. They happen at the hard sites of the economy and governance. They happen at the soft sites of culture, including education, including the public commons, right? So architecturally, city planning, all these things like are race, and they happen interpersonally, the ways we interact, and intrapersonally, the ways in which I see myself and you see yourself. Integration is the only thing that addresses all of those sites as a whole. It's a complete system. And I wanted to offer a framework that people could take. One of the great things about Black Lives Matter is the way, and I was skeptical of this at first, but I've come to embrace it and celebrate it, the ways people have taken these things into their communities, into their lives, into their places of work, into their places of education. I want to offer something that you can take and apply to your own life, to your own space, and all the spaces that you engage. Economics is one of them, obviously.
This is Sandra Miller again. She agrees with you. Since white supremacy is based on anti-Semitism, I'm asking about how to go forward.
So the way to go forward is and I think I know what she's getting at, and many of the things that are said about African Americans are said in Europe originally about Jewish people. And there's nothing especially imaginative about racial slurs, and they repeat, and you hear that about Armenians, and people say the same. If you look at genocides, people say the same dehumanizing things about whoever they're attempting to otherize. Mm-hmm. How do you move beyond it in this country, right? And so in this country, you have to address each site of harm. The specific solutions in each area are going to be different. The overarching framework is you have to integrate them. As long as you're inhabiting segregated spaces, as long as you are engaging segregated spaces, you're living in them, then you're reproducing the race line.
I want to ask really quickly, what, if any, are the distinctions between integration and assimilation?
So that's a great question. And assimilation is participating on the terms of another. Assimilation is erasing self. Now, there's some, right, there's a certain degree of assimilation that simply happens in America. In some ways, it all reduces to Englishness. That's what the melting pot boils down to. But right, in those gross ways, Black people are already assimilated. We're not integrated. And the way, and the terms of participation become terms of self-abnegation.
Okay. We're assimilated, but we're not integrated. I've never heard it put that way. Okay, thank you. Sandra, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I think that when you say white people, you are talking about colonists, colonialness, and the people that believe to this day in that false dynamic.
What's the question?
It was more of a statement. There wasn't a question.
Oh, so yes and no. And certainly America is of a piece with other parts of the former British Empire. The ways that colonialism is constructed are fairly, there's variation, they're fairly consistent around the world. But you see, you don't have to be a colonist to benefit from what's been created. And I talk about gentrification in this case, and there's a term in economics called rent seeking. Don't have to say I'm trying to move the Black people on, or right, there are larger forces doing it on your behalf. All you have to do is not protest them.
From Josh Dunning, is there anything you have changed your mind about or seen in a new light since writing the book?
Yeah, man. Thanks
and
for that.
When were you done? When last draft, boom, when were you done with the book?
Done in January, February of this year. I began the book in the fall of 2017.
Okay.
One of the things I've changed my mind about is, and this is complicated, it is in fact the founders. And I wrote a piece for Harper's about the Obama presidency. I've done a lot. I wrote a book called Dominion that takes place in colonial America before the revolution. I've studied the pre-revolutionary and revolutionary period a lot. In writing this book, I read all that stuff again. And I came to think that some of the ways that we talk about them are unfair, or some of the ways in which it's become fashionable to speak of them are unfair. That the things that divided them are very similar to the things that divide us. That if any of them came back, they would recognize our political conversation. And right, so the people who we speak of when we mean founders, people we know, were almost universally against the slave trade, which didn't say they didn't harbor racial attitudes. The forces that allow that to continue were economic forces, Southern planters, right, in the Carolinas, as well as Northern shipping interests. And I looked at the excise passages that Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. I looked at some of the writings of John Adams again, or John Quincy Adams, who was the first president from the second generation. So he's offering, and of course, John Adams' son, who has unique private insight into some of their thinking. And I think that they were, without being woke, way woker than we give them credit for.
From Anonymous, you've written online about Blackness in media, TV, music, etc. What role can popular media, both from Black creators or otherwise, play in moving us forward?
Well, media, to the extent that it's popular, this is the culture that you're floating in, right? These are the forces that are shaping you. And the ways that they're invisible forces. Edward Said talks about this in Cultural Imperialism in beautiful fashion. You're not aware of them. You first learn your own culture, what's presented to you as your own culture. If you are, right, when you take that without questioning, you're almost set up naturally in antagonism to other cultures. And so, yes, certainly right on the screen, on the page, some of the easiest places because it is the imagination. I mean, you're talking about the imagination earlier. It's much easier to imagine a thing than build it. If you don't imagine it, you cannot.
Yeah, like, if we would have continued on that conversation about Lena Dunham and even David Chase, I feel like the larger issue is that Black creatives aren't given the same space and the same resources and the same opportunity to explore neuroses and self-consciousnesses and whatever that David Chase or Lena Dunham were given. And so perhaps the issue isn't for Lena Dunham to make girls more culturally representative of Brooklyn, but for the Black version of Lena Dunham, and there are many of them out there, to be given that same opportunity to create her world on TV.
I agree with you, and right, like I agree, and this is where everyone has the same access to opportunity. I agree with you, and in such a world where there were more Black voices, where our towns weren't segregated, where our schools weren't segregated, that vision that's put forth there would be far less likely. And it is in many ways, I haven't seen it, so I don't know whether it's harmful or benign or what her intentions are. But yes, when you have greater representation, but it's not just the screen, it's across this society. You want to take one more?
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. There's about 5. I'm going to choose the best one. um, okay. The person is asking for specific actions that they could take right now to help economically, culturally, and personally to answer this tremendous question.
So that's a tricky question to answer without knowing the specifics of that person's circumstances. What do you do? Where do you live? Right? Like you can affect things in your community. You can affect things in obviously who you vote for and who you elect, but also those things that you push to have addressed. And we have an election coming up. We keep talking about Biden's going to choose a woman, maybe a woman of color. And it's like, yeah, like that's a great theater perhaps, but will it be someone empowered to affect things at the federal level? Barring that, what can I affect on the local level, on the state level? The right has been incredibly savvy about using the levers of local politics to forward its agenda. What can you do? So it's how do you live? Look at how you live. Look at the ways that it is raised. Look at the ways that it is segregated, and work to undo those things.
All right. I think that's it. It's a little bit past 9, so we're going to wrap up. I just want to again thank you so much, Coffin, for writing this book. For I don't know, for extending and for imagining, and helping us get to this place that I think we all that at least we say we want to get to. Whether or not everyone actually wants to get there is another question, but there's the veneer of progress that I think that a lot of us are carrying. And so I think that your book does a great job of centering that in a historical context, but also providing, current relevant context and steps to imagine.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. We only need 10% of people to be very serious, and the rest will follow from that. I wanted this book to be for people who wanted a more complex, a more challenging, more in-depth conversation with this material as I think you're having, and love you for that. Thank you for giving me your time tonight and doing this.
Oh, no doubt.
Continued.
No doubt. All right.
All right.
Thank you both so much. And everybody for joining us tonight. It's been fantastic. It's your patronage that enables us to bring you programming like this. And we cannot host these types of events without it. Yes, show that book. Thank you, Damon. And purchase that. There's a link in the chat to purchase that book right there, A More Perfect Reunion. Go there, do it, buy that book. It'll be sent to you. You can pick it up at the store. We finally opened on Monday, some limited hours and all that, but we're starting to do that. This is such an important conversation that obviously can't be wrapped up in an hour, but the conversation continues. We have many things coming up, such as Tiffany Cross with Say It Louder, and that's tomorrow night at 8 p.m. And then on Saturday at 8 p.m. is Brenda Jones and Christian Trotman with Queens of the Resistance. And they're in conversation with Tamika Mallory. So that should be awesome. Thank you both so much, Damon, Calvin. It's been fantastic. It's just such a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, y'all. Thank you
right.
kindly. Stay safe and stay well read.
All right.
Right on.
Bye.